Hey vinyl community, this is Tim with the University of Vinyl. Thanks again for checking back in and watching my channel. I appreciate all the recent comments, all the likes, all the subs. It's been fantastic to watch. And today I'm going to go ahead and announce, drum roll, just kidding, I'm going to start a new series called Liner Notes. Liner Notes is going to be a video that's going to focus on one album from a particular artist or band that I feel has been swept under the rug, forgotten, or maybe even derided by fans as being subpar. I want to kind of delve deeper into these albums and talk about their redeeming qualities and why they shouldn't be left to the wind. So in May of 1987, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers released Let Me Up, I've Had Enough. Probably one of the worst regarded cover art for an album that we've seen recently. Of course, this is kind of an amalgam. If you didn't know, this is a little bit of a cut and paste job of all 5 of the Heartbreakers at that point in time, comprised to show one screaming face. And Let Me Up, I've Had Enough can quite accurately kind of state the state of the mind of Tom Petty in late 1986 into early 1987. Petty was going through a period of upheaval. There was a lot of friction between Tom Petty and Stan Lynch that would eventually cause Stan Lynch to be fired from the band a few years down the road. But in 1986 and 1987, Tom Petty and the band were backing up Bob Dylan, and they did a couple different legs of world tours, and this album was actually recorded in between tours and a little bit on the fly. So typically, Petty would have had mapped out a great group of songs ready to roll in the studio. This time, it was Mike Campbell who had actually had 3 excellent songs that he had methodically built up, and he was ready and wanted these things to be seeing the light of day, whether with Tom Petty or maybe somebody else. So a little backdrop, remember, in 1984, on Building the Perfect Beast, Don Henley released The Boys of Summer. Now, The Boys of Summer was a huge hit for Don Henley, and it's something that Tom Petty, when Mike Campbell brought it to him, Tom Petty passed on it. He wasn't sure that he liked it, didn't really, the music just didn't click with him. So Mike brought it to Don Henley, and the rest is history. So that was 1984. This time around, Mike Campbell, as I mentioned earlier, he had worked on 3 songs for quite some time. And one of those songs is Runaway Trains, track 2 on side 1. If you give a listen to Runaway Trains, I'm calling it a cousin to Boys of Summer. There's a lot of similar keyboards, a lot of similar chords and changes in that song that kind of are a little bit reminiscent of the Boys of Summer. So Petty liked the music, and rather than let that go, he decided, hey, I'm going to come up with some lyrics and we're going to make this a Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers song. And it's one of the standout tracks on this album. Of course, the big song off of this album was co-written actually between Tom Petty, Mike Campbell, and Bob Dylan, Jammin Me. Check out the video. The video is a little bit dated. There's some cultural references and politics that they're of the time, which is 1986, 1987. A lot has changed in the world since then, but it is still a driving, fantastic song. Interestingly enough, it was not actually put out on Tom Petty's Greatest Hits album, although it did make the light of day on one of the later comps that the estate has put out in recent years. Another thing to remember about this time period, in 1985, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers put out Southern Accents. Southern Accents is a problematic record, to say the least. So remember, Southern Accents was a cut and paste job from several different sessions, many of which were heated. Tom Petty was going through some things during that album. Of course, he famously shattered his hand. He punched the wall during a recording session that he was frustrated with. And there were multiple producers on that album as well. Remember, there was Jimmy Iovine for some of the tracks, Dave Stewart from Eurythmics fame, Don't Come Around Here No More, co-written with Tom and partially produced by Dave. You had Robbie Robertson producing the title track, Southern Accents. There was a lot going on in that album. And the knock on that album for some people, there's too much going on, there's too many horns, there's too many synthesizers. What's the identity of this album? So when it came time to do Let Me Up, I've Had Enough, Petty wanted to have a back to basics live sound. So that meant the only kind of artificial things that were going to be on this album that were not the main instruments of the Heartbreakers was going to be some synthesizer by Benmont Tench. Now during that time as well, Petty was having thoughts in his mind like, I'm not sure, have we really kind of hit a wall with the Heartbreakers? What else is there to say? And what are we doing back in Bob Dylan for 2 years almost? After this album came out, the next thing that would happen with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers is Tom Petty in 1989 decided to put out a solo album, Full Moon Fever. And that really kind of turned the whole Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers enterprise on its head. So in addition to Runaway Trains, the other two songs that Mike Campbell had been working on were All Mixed Up and My Life, Your World. Again, two of the stronger songs on this album. Ain't Love Strange is the third song on side 2. And when you listen to Ain't Love Strange, you immediately think, hey, is this kind of a rewrite of You Got Lucky? Because there's the opening keyboards and synths of Benmont Tench, a little bit of the same rhythm, a little bit of the same time sequence, chord structures, but the lyric is much different and the song actually comes into its own. I personally think it's one of the better songs on the album. So Campbell and Petty were basically able to replicate with Let Me Up, I've Had Enough, the title song. It sounds like a Rolling Stones song circa 1972, 1973. You've got the riffage of Keith Richards shining through on that song. And it has a bit of a tossed off quality to it, but it sounds fantastic. It's a great way to close out this album. How Many More Days is another great song. And I like the way that they just kind of turned up the mix, and that's how the song starts. It fades in. Those are really interesting songs that do that. It makes you think that, where does the song start? Where does it end? And they just decided to turn it up at that point in time when they were ready to start. So as well as issues with the Heartbreakers and interpersonal relationships kind of becoming a little frayed, Petty's personal life was coming a little bit undone as well. He was headed towards a divorce with his first wife. And then in the middle of all this, after this album, I think had been released about a week later, Petty's house burns down. And it turns out it was arson. So kind of a crazy situation. And the saving grace for Petty at that time is they were going back out on tour with Bob Dylan and Roger McGuinn, and they had to go out, so they actually took their families with them, and temporarily were in a hotel before that tour started. But kind of a scary thing, someone burns down his house, and they barely escaped. If there's some interviews and footage you can see on YouTube where Petty was interviewed at that point in time. And he basically got out with the shirt on his back. So that's it. Let Me Up, I've Had Enough by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, released in May of 1987. One other thing about this album that I'll mention, it sounds fantastic, and it's mastered by Bob Ludwig. So check out this album if you haven't listened to it lately. It's pretty easy to find out there in used bins. It's not too expensive. It hasn't risen in, been jacked up with the untimely death of Petty several years ago, and you can still find it reasonably well, moderately inexpensive. That is the first episode of my new series, Liner Notes. I'm going to try and put one of these out once a month. I have an album by Neil Young that I'm going to be talking about in the next one. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody, and I hope you have a fantastic day.